Later on this month, on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly, the Africa Policy Conversations will be hosting a forum in partnership with the Serious and Vance Center for International Justice and OVG, Black Empowerment Movement, on the African economic empowerment. That's the theme, and how it can lead to inclusive growth for the indigents on the African continent. So joining us from our Abuja studios, Chinenye Uwanaka. She's a managing partner at the Firma Advisory, and she's going to be part of that movement. Good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. So I guess, what does the forum hope to achieve here as far as empowerment is concerned?
Wow, so we're so excited to be in New York next week for the Africa Policy Conversations UNGA side event. It's a one-of-a-kind event put together by young Africans. It's a homegrown platform, and we're hosting a lot of thought leaders, innovators.
Yeah, keep going. We can see and hear you clearly. Go right ahead. Me? Yes, you're fine. You're perfectly fine. We can hear you. Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. So we're hosting policymakers, philanthropists, investors, people who are passionate about the African continent, and then folks in the diaspora. We all know that a lot of Nigerians have jackpot, over the years and are doing great things on the continent from where they are in the diaspora. So as Africa Policy Conversations, we're a think tank, homegrown, like I said. We have about 200 volunteers in various African countries, and we're coming together to be change agents to make a difference. And next week on Friday, we all know the UN General Assembly will be happening in New York. And we're having this one-of-a-kind event with our partners and making sure that we're not just talking, but we're facilitating opportunities for Africans, especially young Africans and women-owned entrepreneurs, women-owned businesses, to come together to access funding for the first time at this event. So we're really excited and we're looking forward to it.
Great stuff. All right, along the same themes, I understand we also have Amina Maina. She's the vice chair of the Nigerian Economic Summit Group, and also going to be, a convener at the NES 29. And you're also, NESG, I think there's going to be in October, I believe, you're having a discussion on inclusive growth. So what about the themes, Amina, for your get-together in October? What's going to be the main focus point there? How do we get this inclusive growth?
Okay, so thank you for having me. So the theme for the NESG 29 is the pathways to sustainable economic transformation and inclusion. One of the things that we have considered is the fact that we do have a great problem when it comes to human capital. We see all the issues of young people, jackpotting, and all of that. 70% of our population is youth, and we have to find a way to keep them engaged, to keep them back home. In doing that, the idea, particularly for the NESG 29, is to have the private sector and the public sector come together and talk about what we can do to create employment, to create job opportunities, to improve on our education in the country.
All right, so you're both speaking about things that have similar themes. So, Chinenye, let me come back to you. What are the follow-ups? Because a lot of forums go on. How do you follow up with your events? What are the next steps to make sure that what is discussed at the event is followed through? So, Chinenye, let me start with you. It's going to be the same question for Amina as well. But Chinenye, you go ahead.
Oh, thank you so much. And coincidentally, I'm also a thematic lead for innovation and intellectual property for NASBA, which is an NESG collaboration with the National Assembly. So it's great that you have us both here. But as you mentioned, the next steps, right? So last year we had this event on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly. It's not the first event. We've had several events. We had the Minister of Trade and Investment. We had the Minister of Youth and Sport last year. And a lot of people were at that event saying that they want to come back home. They want to invest on the continent. And they had real questions. And that's why this year we decided to create a deal room where we can facilitate those questions that they have. Because Nigeria, for instance, is not the easiest place to do business. We all know that there are so many hurdles and so many bureaucracies. You can't even find a simple website where you can go and find out information about sectors to invest in. So this year we're bringing a deal room. And beyond that, our events, we always try to have a report And we also try to facilitate capacity building for leaders, not only policymakers, but lawmakers. I just came back from Rwanda 2 days ago, where we took a state house of assembly, you know, the speakers and the principal members, and trained them on the need to have game-changing legislations, because we always talk about growth and development, but it's a collective thing that policymakers, lawmakers, civil society, private sector must all come together. And that capacity is needed because most times the policymakers don't understand the pain points. The lawmakers don't understand the pain points of the citizens. They don't understand the sectors that need real attention and some of the things that they need to do to facilitate growth. And so moving on from our event, we'll make sure that we'll continue to advocate, we'll continue to build the capacity of lawmakers and policymakers, and we continue to gather data that can inform evidence-based and user-centric policies, not only in Nigeria, but in Africa as a whole. Thank you.
All right. Well, Chinenye, I have to say that the Nigerian Stock Exchange, the Nigeria Export Promotion Council, the Nigerian Sovereign Investment Authority, they would fight you if they heard you saying that there's no website for where to invest in Nigeria. But thank you for that. Amina, what about you? What are your follow-ups after the NESG gets together to talk about the pathways to inclusive growth?
So the beauty about the NESG 29 or the Economic Summit generally is that it's usually held in conjunction with the Ministry of National Planning and Budget. And that helps us to have the follow through that we need on the public sector side. From the private sector side, as you can understand, there's a lot of enthusiasm at the moment to see where this administration is going. The first feelers we get is that this is a market-driven government. And I think we've seen some of that in some of the trips and what has come out of the G20 summit, which the president went to. We've seen what has come out of his visit to the UAE. And as private sector, we're quite excited to be able to follow through on that. The NESG being a non-profit, non-partisan organization is always keen to see how we can lead economic reforms, and having the National Budget Planning Ministry partner with us helps us to coordinate with all the other ministers. This year, particularly for the summit, we would have people like the coordinating minister of the economy, the minister of trade and investment, even the health minister, because they're conversations that must take place. And that would help us then say, okay, where are we going? Particularly as this is a transition. This government has just come in. We're able to sit with them together, everyone, private sector, public sector, and come up with what we would want to measure them with, what we would want to see. They've talked about their 8-point agenda. How are we going to measure that? It's one thing to just say, oh yeah, we have an 8-point agenda. But the 8-point agenda does talk about the real issues affecting us today as a country, as people. And after the summit, we will continue to have conversations with them. The NESG on its own normally has different policy centers. So it's not just because of the summit, but even after the summit, through our policy centers, we do work with government, we work with private sector, we do a lot of research. We have a lot of publication that we also put out that helps to just, push the economy in the right direction.
All right, great stuff. As we have that graphic up on the agenda of the president, I want to ask you both about poverty, and because I think it leans into your respective discussions that you will both be having at the NESG 29 and also at on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly. So up there you can see the amount of Nigerians pushed into poverty by inflation. According to the World Bank, 5 million falling into poverty in 2022. They said about 8 million fell into poverty 2020 to 2021. We still have economic challenges this year. So if I could have just the two of you, Chinenye, I'll come back to you. How do we address this issue of poverty? Because it's one thing to say you want to lift people out of poverty. It's harder to do it when people are falling into poverty in the very same year that you plan to lift them out. So Chinenye, how do we address poverty? How are you guys going to be addressing it when you have your forum in New York?
So, at the end of the day, this is the main reason why we're having these events. I'm a young person and I'm very passionate about this country. And honestly, the synopsis that you just showed is very, very bleak. And we all know people who are affected by poverty, even if we are not affected by poverty. And so we must rethink philanthropy. That's actually the first theme of our event. Rethink philanthropy, finance, and investment on the continent, especially from the diaspora. So historically, a lot of people had, aid coming to Africa, to countries, and there was really no change, right? The problems persisted. And now we want to ensure that we create that culture of philanthropy, of impact investing, because Africa is a different continent. Africa needs patient capital, and there's so many ideas, and there's so much creativity, and there's so much innovation, especially with the young people. But then most times they are trapped in their labas and in their niches and in all these places, and they cannot access capital. And that's one of the reasons why we're having that panel conversation on accessing capital. The second panel conversation is on building and strengthening institutions. We all know Africa has weak institutions. When you talk about our access to justice, rule of law, the coups, the political instability, you name it. So at the end of the day, if we don't strengthen our institutions and strengthen the capacity of our public servants, we're not going to have this transformational change that we're talking about. And then another thing is financing innovation. Most people, it still ties back to when I talk about access to capital. Silicon Valley developed because people were able to access angel investing. How can we mobilize domestic capital, get Africans, Nigerians to invest in their own, create homegrown solutions, things that worked in the past. We're bringing all that forward. And then powering, because we need energy, powering for green growth. That's the fourth panel that we're going to be speaking on. We're going to ensure that we're spotlighting just energy transition, because everyone is saying transition, but we need energy first and foremost before we can even talk about transitioning. And then that's where the issue of gas comes in. Right. We know that in Nigeria, there's a decade of gas. So at the end of the day, poverty can only be solved if we create wealth. So we need everybody to put their hands on deck, the policymakers to create the right laws, the enabling environment for businesses to thrive in Nigeria. Thank you.
Thank you. Amina, you get the last word. How do we address this?
Rots, can you hear me?
Yes, go right ahead, Amina. You get the last word. How do we address it?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you clearly. Okay. Yes, go right ahead.
So for us at the NESG, you will find that at the summit, we do have certain panels, plenaries that are geared towards addressing the issue of poverty and inclusiveness. We do have sessions where we're going to talk about, innovation, about the culture of creativity. We want to talk about government. We want to talk about reinventing government. We want to have conversations, real conversations that would be difficult conversations, but they're conversations which we must have. When we talk about taking people out of poverty, I think there's too much dependence on oil. And one of the things we're going to be talking about at the summit is how do we enable other sectors, not just the oil sector. For example, agriculture. Everyone talks about agriculture and how much, arable land we have in Nigeria, but what are we doing with it? We're going to be talking about things like that. We're going to be talking about barriers that, hamper investment. So when Chinenye is talking about things like funding innovation, we want to have conversations around that. We want to have conversations with private sector to say, do we really need to have a buoyant venture capital system in Nigeria? What are we doing to fund these young people? What are we doing about the creative industry? We have arts and culture, we have creativity. All over the world today, you see Nigerians excelling wherever they go. We need to be able to bring that back. And once we're able to establish some of these things, we want to look at it from a grassroots perspective. Because when we talk about, taking people out of poverty or creating jobs, there's always a knock-on effect for whatever somebody does. Starting with the people in the villages, we've had the anchor borrower scheme. Did that really work? We need to be able to have real, honest conversations to say, what are the things that we need to pull people out of this poverty levels that we see, which are unprecedented? Healthcare, education, just even the basic things. Let's start with that.
Fantastic. Great stuff. Thank you both. We appreciate your time, Amina Maina and Chinenye Uwanaka, and wish you both good luck on both your forums that will be discussing these very important economic matters across the African continent, particularly in Nigeria.